Good afternoon and welcome back to KW Property Management Consulting's Community Association Best Practices monthly webinar series. I'm your host, Tim O'Keefe, an Executive Director and Partner with KW Property Management Consulting. Since our last webinar on April 21st, we saw the rollout of the COVID vaccine continue to pick up pace. I've now been vaccinated, so I'm happy to say I'm fully vaccinated. In Florida, there have been 17.5 million COVID doses administered, which means about 36% of our state's population is fully vaccinated. That's up from 25% just a month ago. While many other countries are seeing a spike in COVID cases, the US continues to see significant reductions in the virus. And last week, the FDA and CDC approved Pfizer vaccinations for all children 12 and older. Throughout the US, there have been 274 million vaccines given, with 124 million people fully vaccinated. So that's about 38% of our country. The CDC reports that the US needs between 75 and 80% of the population to be fully vaccinated to reach herd immunity. So we're about halfway there. So keep getting your shots, ladies and gentlemen. 2 weeks ago, Governor DeSantis lifted the state's emergency orders regarding the COVID virus. In doing so, all local emergency orders became null and void, including the need to social distance and wear masks in public. Local governments are restricted from enacting further emergency orders. However, the cancellation of these emergency orders does not, I repeat, does not prohibit private businesses or community associations from requiring masks to be worn or social distancing to be enforced. So what that means, board members, is you can continue to require masks and social distancing in your community if that's what you choose to do. So with first right around the corner, that means the start of hurricane season in Florida. So today we have an expert panel that will help us prepare for this year's hurricane season. As was fitting in 2020, last year was the most active hurricane season on record, with 30 named storms and 13 that reached hurricane strength, including 6 that were considered major storms. Experts predict that the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season will be above average in terms of activity. Experts are predicting 19 named storms this year. Today, we will rely on our panel of experts to discuss how property managers and boards should prepare for hurricane season and address cleanup and potential insurance claims after the storm. We have a few poll questions that you can see. So please respond to those, and during the course of the webinar, I'll give updates on how the responses are coming in. And if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions, and we'll do our very best to get to those today. So let's get started by introducing our esteemed panelists today. First, I want to introduce Mike Jachles. Mike is the chair of the Florida Association of Public Information Officers. Mike's got a background in law enforcement, domestic security, fire rescue, and emergency management. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
My pleasure. Next, we have Brendan Lynch. Brendan is the president and owner of Plastridge Insurance. Plastridge is a family-owned business, a family-owned and operated business founded in 1919. Plastridge has provided stellar service to South Florida customers for more than 100 years. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you, Tim. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Beth Rappaport. Beth is a business development executive and expert landscaper with BrightView, the country's largest landscaping company, servicing all parts of Florida. Beth, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So Mike, let's get started with you. You've got a long title in your name, Chair of the Florida Association of Public Information Officers. Can you tell me exactly what role you play?
Well, a public information officer generally deals with public information and the media. So our job is getting the right information to the right people at the right time so they're empowered to make the right decisions. Currently, that's an association that I chair, but I currently work for the city of Fort Lauderdale as a spokesman or public information officer with the city.
And Mike, I know you've had a lot of experience with hurricanes, so can you talk a little bit about your role in communications and why effective communication and why it's so important when it comes to any emergency situation, including hurricanes?
Well, pretty simply, people's lives depend on information. And with so much social media and misinformation, People really need to have factual information so they're empowered to make the right decisions that could save their lives and or their properties.
So Mike, what kind of advice could you give to a board when they're putting together their hurricane plan? You know, as a management company, KW Property Management Consulting starts working on hurricane plans for every one of the properties that we manage. And we start in February and March. By June 1st, we want every one of our properties to have a customized plan, and we want it to be signed off on by the board. So what advice could you give all of us as far as the thinking that we should go through from a community association standpoint to prepare for the communication that's required to make sure that we're getting the right message out at the right time so the right decisions can get made?
Exactly. The key here is that you have a plan and the association has a plan. But here's the other part. Do you test that plan? Do you exercise that plan? Are you sure it works, or is this just something that's on paper in case you need it? And really, to be effective, you've got to be able to test that plan and use it and make sure it works. You know, a plan is just that. It's a guideline. Things can happen, things can change, but you need that foundation of a plan to work off of. But beyond that, it's great that the association has a plan, but each homeowner or resident needs to have their own personal plan as well.
And what about when it comes to evacuation? So, you know, if the fire marshal comes and knocks on your door and says, guys, we're evacuating, and people want to write it out, what advice would you give to those properties that are in a mandatory evacuation zone?
Well, pretty simple. You know, mandatory evacuation zone, it's really not negotiable, though some people are reluctant or complacent and don't want to leave their home, and that's understandable. But the best thing to do is have a plan and know where to go. When it comes to evacuations, you know, we used to think that, you know, people would think, okay, I live in South Florida. We have a hurricane warning. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to Orlando because they have a lot of hotel rooms or whatever, or I'm going to go to the West Coast. And you know what? We learned pretty quickly that hurricanes don't care where you are. You know, we've had hurricanes crisscross the state and traverse the state. So the last thing you want to do is get stuck trying to evacuate during the storm or go to a place that's going to get hit as well. So really, sheltering in place is the best advice. And, you know, listen to the warnings. If you are in an evacuation zone, that should be part of your plan, having a place to go, whether it's with friends or relatives that, you know, are somewhat near the area, not too far away, because then you're going to get into traffic with evacuations. You're going to get into gas shortages and things like that. So, you know, have that plan and know where you're going to go.
What is the best way to keep up with the news during a hurricane?
Well, best way to keep up with the news, as long as you have power, you know, and internet, you can stay connected that way. TV, to have an off-air TV antenna, or even a battery-powered TV and a weather radio. You know, many people have gotten rid of these old, you know, boom boxes or radios and things. And, you know, we've seen with power outages and storms, they still have a use. So if you have one of those, make sure you have good batteries for it, test it out, make sure you can pick up the radio station on it. That may be your lifeline for information, you know, should a storm hit and we lose power and everything.
So a number of people on this call may appreciate the transistor radio. So there's still a transistor radio, something that existed long ago, right? A few batteries will keep that thing powered up.
It is. I know my daughter, who's 19 years old, would not know what that is.
So let me ask you, Mike, how reliable is information shared over social media?
You know, it depends on the source. You really need to get your information from a trusted source, like your local emergency management office or municipality. That's the starting point for factual information.
Great, that's helpful. And if a local municipality issues the mandatory evacuation and people don't want to leave, what is the consequence of not leaving?
Consequence of not leaving is you could be isolated, or, you know, you could be isolated or you can be in harm's way. How many times have we seen images on the news of people being rescued off of rooftops, evacuating up through their attics or things like that? You know, especially in areas that are prone to storm surge. And storm surge and after the storm is where most injuries and fatalities happen.
Yeah, and what we do from a management perspective is we tell anybody that wants to write it out, even if you've got a terrible situation in your building and you call law enforcement, they are not going to come to your property if they've given you a mandatory evacuation. You are off limits to them.
Especially when it comes to fire trucks. Those are big vehicles, and when winds hit a certain wind speed, whether it's 35 to 50 miles of sustained winds, they're not able to safely respond. So you may very well be on your own. Certainly, they may exercise discretion, but then you're putting your lives and the responders' lives in jeopardy. So it's really best to have a plan beforehand, exercise a plan, have a place to go to evacuate. Don't think you're going to stick it out or at the last minute venture out and think you're going to evacuate, and then you could get stuck in harm's way.
Right. Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Beth, let me ask you, while we're talking about preparation for storms, let's talk about landscaping. Each year there's a schedule of events that takes place to maintain properties, but what should properties do now to prepare this time of the year for hurricane season?
Yeah, so preparing for hurricanes and preparing your landscaping is really a year-round process, because what's most important is that all of your landscaping be healthy and free of disease or pests, because when storm time comes, that unhealthy landscaping is the first thing to go down. Usually best practice well before hurricane season is to have an arborist, a certified arborist, come and inspect all your trees and landscaping, looking for disease, signs of weakness, things that could be a problem, and then follow up with pruning based on the arborist recommendations. And usually, April and May are usually the very busy times to get that done. So there is still time to get that pruning done. But that is really a key part of being ready for hurricane season.
What would be too early to start pruning trees, Beth? As far as preparing for hurricane season, when would it?
Yeah, right, because trees are always growing, so you don't want to prune them too soon and then have to do it again. We have a lot of communities that will prune in the springtime, like March, April, and then they'll do another pruning in the fall, like October, November. And sometimes they'll do that second pruning because they've got a lot of holiday lights going up. And so in order for that, to look good and go well, that second pruning has to happen, but usually in the springtime.
Yeah. And Mike, I don't know if you have statistics on this, but it seems like I've lived in Florida for about 12 years, and it seems like June, July aren't critical months for hurricanes. But once you get to August, September, October, those seem to be the more active months for us. Is that fair to say?
Well, generally the peak of hurricane season is right around the end of the first to the second week of September. But, that's just when it gets busy. It doesn't, all it takes is one storm. And, there's talk about pushing hurricane season back even earlier to start because of the trends that we've seen. I'm not a meteorologist, but, the fact is you really need to, have your area around your home and your communities prepped. So, like Beth said, it's a good time to do that, a biannual cleanup. And this goes for homeowners too. Make sure that, your yard is clean and picked up. And if there is a hurricane watch or warning coming in, clear off all those patio items, anything you may have on a balcony, anything that can become airborne. And you've got to secure all of those things and trim shrubs and hedges, whatever is your own responsibility if your association doesn't take care of it. Same thing with tree limbs. If you have trees in your backyard or whatever, any limbs that are hanging or look like they might strike your house or something or a window, you want to make sure that things are cleared out before hurricane season.
Right. It's kind of interesting because everybody says that hurricane season starts June 1st. So you don't worry about it. It's almost like on June 1st, somebody sends a note, emails Mother Nature and says, okay, you can start the hurricane process now. But they could happen earlier. They could happen at any point in time. Right. So we have to always be prepared for it, but we know that it seems like historically June 1 seems to be a good date to prepare.
Yes, June 1st, you should have your plan already in place. And some of the other things, that you need to take into consideration. We used to say have 3 days of food and water and supplies. Now it's 2 weeks. You need to be able to sustain yourself in case of an extended disaster or outage. Look at what we saw just recently with the gas pipeline cyber attack, right? We saw people with long gas lines and gas stations running out of fuel, and it didn't really affect South Florida at all because we're not on that pipeline. Look at with the pandemic, with the panic buying of the toilet paper and paper towels. So these are things to have, and not everybody can afford to go out and spend $500 on hurricane supplies at the drop of a hat. So it's important to stockpile some staples and necessary items throughout the year. So when hurricane season comes, you have enough of these items and you don't have to go out and incur a large single expense. So these are just some tips to keep in mind, but you need to be able to sustain yourself. And this is in addition to the things that happen if there is a storm watch or warning that comes in. Things like filling your bathtub. So if you have to flush your toilets, you can use the water. Things like setting your freezer and refrigerator to their coldest settings. If you have a generator, the time to test it out is not during a hurricane. Make sure that generator is serviced. Make sure that the oil is changed and it's maintained, because when you may need it, it may not start if you don't maintain it.
And Mike, to that point, one of the questions that we got, Randall in Fort Lauderdale asks, should an association install a backup generator, and are there grants or subsidized programs available for that?
That's a good question about generators. I don't know if there are incentives from the federal government, from FEMA or not. The associations could look into that. Obviously, we've seen gas stations and grocery stores over the recent years have been mandated to have backup generators. But again, a backup generator will only last as long as you have enough fuel for it. So if it's something, for your home, first of all, you have to make sure you have enough fuel so you can run for the duration, because most generators may only run, 8 to 12 or 16 hours on an initial tank if it's a gasoline tank. If it's propane and you have a large tank and a supply, that's a different story. It will run longer. If it's hardline, if it's natural gas, as long as that gas line is intact, then you can run it, indefinitely. So those are some considerations. But again, with an association like an apartment building or a condo looking for a large generator, that's quite an expense. It's quite an investment, but it may pay off. So that's an individual decision that that each board would have to decide.
And then Michael and Boca wanted to know what should be connected to the generator.
Well, the generator, if it's for a large building, things like elevators and common systems, and I don't know, what they would connect for individual units or not. It depends on how much power, but usually a generator like that is just going to carry out essential functions like elevators and like common area lighting and things like that. For your home, you have to see what the generator is rated at. If it's a hardwired generator, one of the larger ones that you see that can power your whole house, that's ideal. If it's a portable generator, then we're getting into things where, fossil fuels can give off carbon monoxide, which can be deadly. And we often see the consequences of that after a disaster. So if you're using a portable generator, it needs to be wired. You really need to have a transfer switch wired into your power supply to your house to do it correctly, because running extension cords, or some people will backfeed a dryer outlet, that's just not safe.
All right, thanks, Mike. Beth, back to you with a question. How can a property, when you have a storm, everybody wants to be the first one that that responds to them. So how can a property get to the top of your priority list, ensure that they have priority cleanup after a storm?
So really the first thing and best practice is to have a hurricane contract signed and in place before hurricane season. And the hurricane contract usually outlines how damage will be assessed, It outlines what are the key areas on your property that are a priority for you to be cleared. It would have on-site property manager and board member details. You know, how many times has there been an emergency and everyone leaves town, and now all of a sudden it's not clear who's in charge on the property or who's authorized to make these kind of very quick decisions that sometimes have to be made after a hurricane. So it's important to have all that updated contact information. As well, you know, what is the insurance carrier looking for in the way of photo documentation? And, you know, in some cases, they might want, you know, journals and notes of how many trucks of debris went out or what came in, what was done, you know, those types of things. And then the hurricane contract also includes rates. So it includes labor rates. How much does it cost per hour for particular pieces of equipment, those types of things. This way, you know, there's no price gouging or any concerns of being overcharged. There's no surprises. You know, the association can budget somewhat for what storm cleanup expenses would be. And of course, it's important to always have the association attorney review the hurricane contract like you would have any contract to make sure that the language in the contract is favorable to the association.
Great, that's great advice. And Brendan, I didn't forget about you. I know you're here. Let me bring a question to you. You know, insurance contracts renew each year and most often not during hurricane season. So what should community associations be thinking about during their insurance renewal period when it comes to protecting themselves from hurricanes?
I would say, Tim, that the number one thing that they should have a significant amount of conversation about is the type of hurricane deductible. There are many different ways to approach this. It's not just in the size of the deductible, but it's what triggers the deductible. For example, there are deductibles that are triggered by hurricane only. And then there's another type of deductible. It's called a named storm deductible, which would include tropical storms, depressions, invests, all these names that we see come through our email. In fact, I don't know if anyone saw, but there was something they're following that started off this morning out there. So really deciding the best way to approach that as an association is a big part of that discussion. And of course, what triggers it and the size of the deductible are the two main points of that discussion.
And Brendan, how does once a storm gets named, how does it affect the property's ability to renew its insurance? Does it go to, if your policy renews in July, August, and there's a named storm, can you still renew? Or do the underwriters say, hang on a second, let's see what happens with this storm before we renew?
So generally speaking, you will be able to renew, but you might be restricted to renewing with the same company that you were with the year before, as opposed to having the flexibility to maybe jump to another company that had better terms and pricing. So that's a big point. It's one of the reasons we tend to not do a lot of our renewals in hurricane season. The other reason that we tend to not have our renewals in hurricane season is the concept of a hurricane calendar year deductible, where you have one large deductible for the entire hurricane season, and the storms can erode that deductible. So if you had a smaller storm come through that still did damage, the damage would go towards the deductible and erode the large deductible, making it smaller.
At that point, if you have damage from a particular storm, why is it important to put your insurance company on notice and to have a claim in the event that another storm comes through later in the year?
Well, that's exactly why, because it is an aggregate deductible. So it's similar to your health insurance. You want those when you're going in to see the doctor and you make that payment, you want to record that, because it reduces your deductible for the period of that policy term. So if you have a $100,000 hurricane deductible and the storm comes through and does $50,000 worth of damage, yes, you're not going to see any money for that damage because it's under your deductible, but going into the rest of the season, you only have a $50,000 deductible. It reduces that. So you want to record that loss.
Yeah, and then Brendan, I know you work with a lot of associations and managers. So from a management company's perspective, we always ask our teams to take inventory and pictures of the property before hurricane season. So why is it important for an association to take inventory of the community before a storm? I know, Beth, you talked about getting photos of things before a storm. So why, from an insurance perspective, Brendan, is that important?
So we refer to that as documenting the pre-loss condition of the property. So basically, it can be as simple as having either the manager or maintenance person or a board member go around with their smartphone and doing a video of the outside of the building. The roof area is a good thing to have, the pool area. And then on the inside of the building, common areas, taking a video of all that area to basically document the condition of the property prior to a loss that might occur during hurricane season. And then at the end of the season, everything goes well, we delete the video and we do it again.
So we're talking about kind of storm preparation right now. Mike, in the middle of the storm, if we get to the middle of the storm and you live in an area that has to be evacuated, what kind of shelters are going to be available this year in Florida? Last year there's a lot of concern about COVID shelters and how we're going to keep people spread out. So what's the plan this year for shelters if you have to move out?
Well, for public shelters, they are really a means of last resort for people that have nowhere to go, whether it's friends, relatives, or other accommodations that they can make. It is far from a hotel. There are no accommodations there. You have to bring your own items of what you need. This is a last resort place. So, and then there are special needs shelters, and those are set up ahead of time. If you have special needs, medical situation, and you need a special needs shelter, you need to reach out to your local municipality or your county emergency management office because they have a registry. You can't just show up at a special needs shelter. In fact, they don't even publicize the locations of those shelters for that exact reason. So that has to be set up well in advance of hurricane season so you'd know where to go should you need to go.
And will they have vaccinated shelters versus unvaccinated shelters?
That's a good question, but that is quite a logistical challenge, So, and fortunately in South Florida, we didn't have to stand up any shelters during the pandemic, but it's certainly a concern. So that's something that the emergency managers at each level, at each county, work at to try and determine what works. But, with the plan last year, they were basically the capacity of the shelters, if they were needed, were reduced because of the social distancing.
Good. So Brendan, let's say that we've got people in shelters, the storms come through, we come out the next day, we see that there's damage. What property damage is actually covered from hurricane damage?
So that's a good question. So generally when and I'm a native of South Florida, and generally when these storms come through, big or small, when you open the door for the first time and you see what's going on, you generally see a lot of landscaping debris, broken branches and leaves, and it kind of looks like a bit of a war zone. On the smaller storms, we typically don't see a lot of property damage unless, of course, one of those tree branches struck one of the buildings. The policies do offer landscape coverage, but it's important to communicate how that works. And I would encourage everybody to talk to their agent about this, because that particular line item doesn't come into play unless there is physical damage to the building, the insured building. So it's the landscape coverage is intended to kick in when the policy triggers. So if there is damage to an insured structure, then there can be 25, 50, or 100,000, depending on the policy, worth of landscape coverage, usually subject to a maximum amount per tree or shrub or hedge. But it's important to know that that coverage isn't available if it's only landscape coverage or landscape that's damaged, not the insured structures.
And Beth, do you get asked often about landscaping insurance, and what kind of advice do you give your customers if they come to you and say, do you guys offer that, or can I get insurance for my landscaping? Because there's a lot of properties that have millions of dollars worth of landscaping invested in their communities.
Yes, we get a lot of questions about that, as well as fences. We get a lot of questions about, are fences insured? But what we really stress is that the most important thing for the financial well-being of the association is just to do everything possible to prevent claims. And one trend we've seen is insurance companies coming to the property owners and saying, hey, we're not going to renew your policy until you get these, tree branches off the roof line or things like that. So that's actually helped support the push for more of the preventative maintenance that, that really should be happening on an ongoing basis, and does make it more of a priority.
Great. That's, everybody spends a lot of money on their landscaping, and unfortunately, there's just not a lot of coverage that you can get. So preparing in advance and keeping your plants healthy, as you talked about, Beth, is probably the best insurance you could have for your landscaping. Because if it's susceptible, it will likely blow over during a storm. So the healthier it is, greater chance it has of surviving the storm.
Yes, and you see a lot of things that are done, especially to trees, and they're done with good intentions, but it's just the absolute worst things that you could do to a tree. And some of them are illegal, like hat racking. And really what it does is it just does, very long-term damage to the tree that the tree can never recover from. It can never be totally healthy again after some of these things have been done to it.
All right, so you got to tell us what a hat rack is then.
Well, a hat rack is actually just like what it sounds like. It looks like, you could hang your hat on it, and it's, all the foliage cut off and just the trunk left and a few branches protruding from the trunk.
So don't
Hey,
have.
Tim,
Yes, sir.
I think the hat rack might assimilate to the transistor radio for some people.
Yeah.
But I wanted to add one thing, and I don't know if this was covered earlier and I missed it, but it's important for associations too to have a contract in place with somebody for debris removal after the storm, because you know what? It's hard to get people. It's hard to get contractors. It doesn't matter what preferred vendors you have, but unless you have something in paper, in writing, that they're going to give you a priority there, you may have down trees blocking your roads for some time, right?
Right. And actually, it's a question for Beth that I had. So properties create staging areas for debris.
Yes.
There's not always a lot of room in some of these properties. So you got to figure it out, right?
And it can be tough. It's got to be away from, mailboxes.
So what do you recommend?
Just to, to find a place that's going to be acceptable, that it might not look so good for a while. That's, not near mailboxes, power lines, drainage, buildings, any of that. But, in some large scale storm events, for example, Hurricane Irma, only so much landscaping debris could be, taken, at a time to the facilities, and the facilities were turning trucks away because they didn't have the capacity for the volume of debris. And so that's where the year-round planning really comes into play, because if you're maintaining your landscaping very well all year round, when there is a storm event, you won't have as much debris to deal with.
And does your company take away debris, or do you mostly stockpile the debris and then wait for the cities to come in and remove it after the storm? Because that could take 2 weeks up to 6 weeks after the storm sometimes to remove debris.
No, we do take the debris away, and we will even bring in extra people and equipment to help with that effort. Really, our goal is to get the property back in, a functioning state within a week of the storm event. So we will send extra trucks and equipment to do that.
Yeah, so one of our listeners is making a great recommendation. If you've got the space, Dina says your visitor parking can be a great spot for debris pile ups. So that could be a good place for staging.
Yes, absolutely. And another thing, depending on how the landscaping in your community is handled, it is important to separate the common area debris from the residential home debris. Because in some instances that's handled differently. The municipality or the county is responsible for picking up from the homes, and the community's landscaper is responsible for picking up the common area.
Great. So when we're talking about hurricane plans, one of the poll questions we asked was, will your association have a formal hurricane plan in place this year? And by June 1st. And 76% said yes. So good for all of you that have a plan. I know Kathy is a listener, and she said that her association doesn't publish anything for owners. Is there a statute that requires it to be done? Kathy, there is no statute that requires a hurricane plan, but it's a best practice. So of the 76% that said yes, they do have a plan in place by June 1, 16% said not by June 1, but eventually they'll have it, hopefully not too late. And then 8% said no, they don't plan on creating one. So sounds like from a best practices standpoint, people are following that best practice of putting the plan in place, which is fantastic.
Hey, Tim, I just wanted to mention one more thing on the landscaping aspect. I wanted to mention that it's possible if a tree goes down and it's impeding access to the property, there might be coverage for that under your insurance policy. And additionally, if the tree lands on an insured building, there would be coverage possibly to remove the tree from the building. So these are areas where you could possibly find coverage under your policy for the landscaping.
Good. So Brendan, when you do walk outside, you see the tree that's leaning against the building. What's the best approach now? Do you feel like you've got a claim? So how would a board or a property manager, what are the first steps they want to take in filing a claim for the association?
So the first step is always going to be to mitigate further damage. So if you've got this tree that's caused an opening in the roof of the building, the first step is to get a roofer out there to get a tarp over it. If you can't get the tree off, even if you can't get the tree off, they'll figure it out. They'll find a way to stop the rain from coming in until your landscape company can get out there and get it completely resolved. That's kind of first priority. The next step is to obviously document with pictures and get the claim rolling in terms of calling your agent, letting them know what happened, send them pictures, and then really what you want to do in tandem with having a field adjuster sent out to look at the damage, you want to go ahead and start getting proposals to fix the issue, remove the tree, fix the roof. So go ahead and start getting those estimates together. Call a couple, if you have relationships. This is kind of the time you want to lean on relationships. I'm not saying that you don't want to go out and shop for the best price, but at a time where there's way more demand than there are supply in terms of number of companies, this is when you really lean on your relationship with your vendor and kind of ask them to come through for you.
And from the time that a storm hits, how much time does an association have to file a claim?
So actually, right now it's 3 years, but after July 1st, assuming that the bill that was just passed is signed by the governor, that's going to go down to 2 years.
Okay. Very good. I know I've seen a lot of activity from Irma because last September 10th, I guess, was the 3-year mark. And I saw a lot of activity in the last, 6 weeks or so of that 3-year period where people were putting claims in. So they're going to have to hustle a little bit more if it's going to be cut down to 2 years.
That's right.
And then Brendan, what are the different roles that the players from an insurance claim standpoint play? So what's the role of the insurance broker in filing a claim? And then how do you compare that to what role a public adjuster might play or an attorney?
Sure. So What happens in a claim, is that you'll report the claim to your agent, and then the agent will make sure that information gets to the insurance company. Then there's a field adjuster, which is generally a third-party company that's hired or contractually hired by the insurance company to go out and look at the damage. That field adjuster will prepare a report which will include documentation and photos of the damage and most likely what they think the cost will be to resolve it. That report goes to a desk adjuster. Now, the desk adjuster is an employee of the insurance company that writes your policy. Those are the players that are involved. And assuming that all of that goes well, there really isn't a need for a public adjuster or an attorney. Now, when things aren't going, what I tell my clients, when you feel like the insurance company has let you down, they're not doing handling well, they're not communicating well, they're not following through with what you think the policy says they should do, that's when you consider engaging a public adjuster and or an attorney. And the difference there is a public adjuster basically consult you through the claim process, but they have no legal standing in terms of having to hold the insurance company accountable in court or in a legal situation. That's when you'd have to hire an attorney. So a public adjuster can resolve a claim without involving an attorney, but if it's a very difficult claim, then an attorney is going to probably have to get involved either way. The hope, though, at the end of the hope is that you don't have to use either, and that the insurance company does the right thing and takes care of the claim, and and the association is made whole, and that's the reason we buy insurance.
And I think that's for the importance of the agent. So your agent from Plastridge has to play a very key role in making sure that just because you buy insurance doesn't always feel like you're getting a fair shake from your insurance company. So the broker has to sometimes step in and provide some consultation about whether or not that's a fair offer being made for the claim, or take the next step, maybe get a public adjuster, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, there's a reason why a public adjuster has a different license than I have. There is a purpose and a role for public adjusters in the insurance equation. My professional opinion is that purpose is when you feel the insurance company isn't cooperating or doing the right thing. To go and hire a public adjuster out of the gate probably is going to be received as confrontational.
All right, terrific. So we got about 15 minutes left. I got some questions that have come in from our audience prior to getting started today. So Mike, if I could ask you, Mary Ann from Deerfield Beach mentioned that their association has been very cautious with COVID protocol. And I don't know if you get involved when the governor puts out emergency orders and the communication of that, but her question was really wrapped around, when will the governor's emergency orders end? I think we already communicated that the emergency orders have been rescinded. So Mary Ann, the policies can still be put in place, and you can have a more restrictive policy for your association, but government agencies have to abide by what the governor has said. So Mike, what's your role in communicating that kind of information? How often do people tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, Mike, what's this actually mean for us?
Well, I've been more involved with the vaccine effort and the testing effort. And, right now, obviously, as you said, with government agencies lifting in compliance with the governor's latest order, but private businesses can still enforce it at their discretion. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to common sense, courtesy, and respect. Me personally, outdoors, if I'm outdoors and it's wide open, I won't have the mask on. But if I'm around other people in a setting, it's like when in Rome, do as the Romans, if you will. So, I'll put a mask on if I'm in an office or with near other people, and I still try and maintain social distancing as well. given the peculiarities of the virus and the variants and these other things, while things are looking good, I don't think, we're out of the woods yet in the long term, and ask me that question in a year from now. But we do know hey, this was a very quiet flu season, wasn't it? Why? Because people were wearing masks and we were taking these precautions. So, the more we can do now with people getting vaccinated and practicing these basic recommendations, and they're just recommendations at this point because we don't have that order in place anymore in the state, we can try and mitigate this sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's been interesting. So in the last year, we kind of learned how to battle the common cold and the flu, right? So you socially distance, wash your hands, wear masks, be cautious. You don't get sick quite as often.
Yeah, I think the one thing this has taught people is that, hand washing and basic hygiene practices really go a long way in preventing the spread of germs.
Absolutely. So Mike, I know we kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but James in Boca is talking about, the practice of barrier island towns often require residents to evacuate. And if during a category 1, 2, or 3 hurricane. So he's saying, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but let's specifically address James' question. What is the suggested location to move to during a storm?
That's an individual decision. But ideally, if you're in an evacuation zone, you want to move to an area that is not in an evacuation zone. So the barrier areas, low-lying areas, and of course, mobile homes that are prone to damage from high winds and flooding, any areas like that. You don't want to make yourself isolated where, you can't get help if you need it or put yourself in harm's way. So it's an individual decision whether you have relatives or friends or somebody that you can stay with. Another thing I don't think we touched on for associations, especially for condos or apartments, especially those perhaps with elderly populations, even if there's a storm coming in and you're not being evacuated, but there's the threat or a chance that you could be impacted by a storm, maybe in another area, you may not be in the area and you lose power. Part of your plan should include things as having neighborhood captains that can check on residents, having numbers, knowing who to call and who to get a hold of from property management should you need them. And these are all part of your plan that should be developed well in advance of hurricane season.
Right, and then Charles in Key Biscayne has mentioned that after Irma, they forgot to fill out a permission form so the city or FEMA could come and remove debris, and they ended up paying thousands of dollars. What is the process to get some government support to remove some of the debris in communities? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm not intimately familiar with that, but I would urge them to check with their local or municipal, for the village of Key Biscayne, their emergency management office or emergency manager. They will have that information. I'm sure they'll be able to provide that information. Another good resource is the FEMA website, ready.gov, that has a lot of hurricane information and information on the FEMA website about reimbursement for things. Some of it gets a little complex. That's why it may be easier just to go to your local or your county emergency management office as a good starting point.
Thanks, Mike. Brendan, you'll like to know that from our poll questions, one of the questions we asked is, do you have an effective communication plan with your owners and residents before, during, and after the storm? 85% yes, and 15% said no. When asked, have you reviewed your insurance policy deductibles in the past 24 months? 83% said yes, and 3% said no, and 14% said they're actively doing it. So that's a good thing from your perspective, Brendan. People are paying attention to their deductibles. But a question that came in, Brendan, from Lawrence from Boynton Beach, he wants to know the experience of the insurance industry. Do extra concrete roof tiles or leftover heavy patio blocks stacked in a hidden cove outdoors between an AC unit and a building really become airborne? Same for rain gutter drips, rodent traps, and mailboxes in the ground.
So first of all, I was glad to hear those stats on the deductible, because I'm always surprised as much effort as we put into communicating the large deductible associated with hurricanes. I'm always surprised when we have an event and then we have to go through that the when I have a few situations where I had no idea we had such a large deductible. Which is the case on everybody's policy. Even your homeowner's policy has a larger hurricane deductible. In terms of debris, everything is it has the potential to be a missile in the right conditions. Even in Irma in Palm Beach, I had a client. Their buildings have the coal tar and they have the ballast. That rock ballast, those basically become bullets, and they shattered several impact windows. They were thrown so fast and so hard by the winds in Irma, which in Palm Beach County wasn't that substantial, that around a dozen impact windows or sliders were shattered. So it doesn't matter the size or the shape; it has potential to be dangerous.
If it's outside, it can fly. So I think even if
Correct.
you think it's in a protected area, you know, when that wind starts to whip and it gets under something, it's so powerful. It doesn't take much for it to lift something. Even you think a cinder block for us to carry it might feel heavy, but to the wind, that's like a cotton ball. It can whip that thing around. So I think it's best to remove everything from outdoors if you possibly can, or else you might end up not being happy with the results of that.
Yeah.
And also, when you talked about deductibles, Brendan, one of the things that sometimes we get asked about is how do we create deductibles for our landscaping? And Beth, I don't know if you want to speak to this at all, but what we sometimes recommend to clients would be to set up a deductible through a reserve. So you can have a landscaping reserve and you put money aside every year so that in the event that you don't have adequate coverage for landscaping, and nobody does, if you have big damage, there's already some funds that are set aside in a hurricane reserve that you can use to put the property back together. And do you see that very often, Beth?
Not as often as we would like, but yes,
I
we
don't
see it.
know.
We see it on a lot of our higher end properties where they really, you know, the landscaping is just part of the aesthetics of the community. So yes.
One of the other things, Tim, that might be considered, and I recommend this also to facilitate the hurricane deductible, because we all know that the associations have the mechanism of assessing the owners to cover those deductibles, and that's generally their plan A in the long run of recuperating their deductible. But there's got to be a short-term better solution, because assessments take a lot of time. It's not uncommon for these large buildings that we all work with to have a $1.5 million, $2 million hurricane deductible. So, you know, if your roof ends up in the parking lot, you know, to assess to cover the 25, 30% to secure a contract to get a new roof, assessments take time. And those roofing companies that have the ability to do those types of roofs, they're literally going to be slammed. You could end up in the back of a line that's 2 years long, just because you didn't have the ability to secure a contract. So having a line of credit, which could also be used for landscaping, is critical, because assessments just take too long. You need to be in a position to secure a roofing contract within a week of the storm, or you could end up at the back of a really long line. And that's what we saw in Hurricane Wilma. We had $650 million in damage in Wilma for our clients. And we found the ones that recovered the quickest had the ability to secure contracts, and they had the relationship with their roofing company to get them out there quickly. That was the secret sauce.
That's a really good point, Brendan. It's when you talk about, the storms and the damages and getting people to come out quickly. Having a good emergency list. One of our poll questions is, do you have a list of emergency vendors prepared that will respond after a storm? And 77% said yes. So that's good that you know who you're going to call in the event of a storm. And that's an important part of what we all try to do, is make sure you've got that list, know who you're going to call, and know that they're going to be responsive to you, because the quicker you can get yourself back on your feet and return to normal operation, the better off all the properties are going to be. So, we're coming up. We just got 5 minutes left. So I want to ask each of you one more question. I'll ask the same question. So, Mike, I'll start with you and put you on the spot first, and that'll give Brendan and Beth the chance to think about this question. But, we've had a crazy last 12 or 14 months with COVID and all the storms that we've seen in the past year and the challenges that we faced. So, Mike, what do you believe that we were able to accomplish over the course of the last year that we never thought even doable just 12 or 14 months ago?
Well, I think basically the response to the pandemic, we had done from an emergency management and disaster response effort, have executed the whole response here in the state of Florida, with the Division of Emergency Management. This is what they do. They plan, prepare, and train and respond to disasters. But the unique thing about the pandemic is that, during a disaster, think about it like this. With a hurricane, okay, we have a hurricane warning, the hurricane's coming. You have to get ready. You have to, clear out your yard, put your shutters up, make sure your gas is topped off, all these things. And then the storm comes, you stay inside or you evacuate. Okay, the storm passes, then the all clear is given, then you come out and, then you're in the recovery phase of that. But with the pandemic, I liken it to, this is a disaster that you can't see. It's not a hurricane. So that made it more complex. We're responding to a disaster at the same time we're recovering. Think about it, with the economy and everything else. We're in the disaster response mode, but we're also in the recovery mode, trying to get things back up and running and keep things running. And again, this was a disaster that you couldn't see. And I think the will of the people and as trying as it was and difficult, people really persevered. And, that's what we do. We've had a history of disaster response in Florida. That's something that we take for granted in the state. We really have a very good emergency management response at all levels, not just at the state level, but the 67 counties as well. This is something that we do, and we've also embraced all hazards. So it's not just hurricane response, it's whatever the disaster is. In this case, it was a pandemic. And again, this is likely to be a once in a lifetime event that we incurred, but the takeaways from it and the lessons learned will help us prepare and respond better to future disasters.
Great, thank you. Brendan, let me ask you the same question. What have we learned in the last year from maybe anything you've encountered in the insurance industry that you didn't think was really doable in the past?
I think that what we learned is that associations are going to do what's necessary to keep everybody safe. And, even when it's the hard choices, the difficult choices, I saw, some infighting with board members that had to make these difficult choices and people that wanted to be able to use their amenities. But at the end of the day, the whole thing was about keeping people safe through that. And that's the same approach that we have to take during hurricane season. We need to make sure that we take these storms serious. I've had so many people over my 22 years tell me that they feel their building will never have damage. And I hope that's true. But I mentioned that we had 650 million in damage from Wilma. And I think some of those people thought their building would never be damaged. So just taking these seriously and treating it with respect in the same fashion we did with the pandemic is the right approach.
Well, and you make a good point. So this is I need to applaud some people here, Brendan, based on your comment, because board members are volunteers. Board members get challenged and asked to do a lot. There's a lot of people that are apathetic in communities. So thank you all for being board members and for standing up and trying to do the right thing for your communities each and every day. It's it can be a thankless job that you have, and the pay's not very good, but you do it because you care about your property, you care about your property values, you care about your neighbors, and we certainly respect and appreciate you for the efforts you put in as board members, because it's not easy every day. And then you throw things like storms and insurance claims and pandemics on top of it. It just makes your role that much more important in the community. So thank you all for doing that. And then Beth, same question to you. What have you guys learned over the last year that you didn't know were even possible a year ago?
I think one of the greatest things that has come out of the pandemic is improvements in communication. Just finding new and different ways to communicate accurate information to residents, and as well as making sure that all residents feel heard, even if they have differing and opposing opinions. And especially in post-storm cleanup, it's really important that the property management company conveys to the residents what's happening in regards to the landscaping, and why the road needs to be cleared first for first responders before we can get the tree off the roof of that other building, and just the order, the logical order things need to happen in, and why and when it's happening, because it's really important for residents to stay inside and stay away from those types of things for their own safety until the all clear is given.
Thanks for that. That's a great point. And, it's kind of interesting, like we all come from different walks of life, the four of us that are on this webinar exchanging information, but we all kind of come back to the same thing. We're all servicing the same type of customers, and we see the same challenges. And I think we take different approaches, but we come back to the same way to talk about servicing the clients, great communication, preparing and having plans for everything that we do. I think that's kind of the secret in life, is to be well prepared for even the worst of situations. And something like a pandemic, nobody was prepared for that. But the terrific response, I think, has kept people as safe as we possibly can. And so again, thank you all. So I think we're at the top of the hour, so we'll kind of wrap up. So today it's a great conversation. Thank you all so much for getting all the Floridians prepared for hurricane season. We had a terrific panel today. We should now be better prepared for hurricane season. One big takeaway for me is to get your supplies now. Don't wait, because shortages happen. Mike talked about things that don't even affect us, like we're not even on the grid sometimes, but people respond to fear. And when we start to hear about shortages, the supply chain is interrupted very quickly. So, make sure you have your supplies. Many thanks to the hundreds of people that signed up for today in all the Florida residents. Today's session is recorded, so you can watch this broadcast again or share it with a fellow board member. You can find it on our website at kwpmc.com, coronavirus. I want to sincerely thank all of you that joined us today. Special thanks to our panelists, Mike Jachles, Chair of the Florida Association of Public Information Officers, Rappaport, Business Development Executive with BrightView, and Brendan Lynch, President and owner of Plastridge Insurance. Thank you all. You were fantastic.
Thank you, Tim.
My pleasure. We look forward to having everybody join us again next month as we continue our talk and best practices of community associations. The third Wednesday of the month from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So from all of us at KW Property Management and Consulting, stay cautious, be respectful to your neighbors, and stay healthy. Thank you all for joining us today. Bye now.
Thank you.